If we're going to look at the economy as a whole, instead of just looking at a single market, we're going to need some sort of description of what's going on in all of the markets at the same time. The simplest model that we can look at is one that has just two goods. And if we're going to look at how those goods are produced, we can describe the supply side of the model in the following way. Just for concreteness, I'm going to talk about two goods, wine and cloth. And we're going to need some kind of tool to describe the economy's production possibilities. To do that, we're going to make some simplifying assumptions. We'll assume that the economy has just a given amount of productive resources. So we're really just looking at the economy at a point in time. Those resources are typically described in aggregate terms. We can talk about the total amount of labor in the economy, the total amount of capital that can be employed, and the total amount of land that might be available. Later on in the course, we'll see that we may want to talk about specific kinds of labor, skilled and unskilled, for example, or we may want to talk about specific kinds of capital that are employed in particular industries. We're also going to assume a certain technology or a certain level of technological knowledge that exists at a point in time. The idea of technology is a fairly broad one. It includes not only detailed information about how to produce things, but also about how production can be organized, how goods can be marketed, and so on. Well, let's have a look at the typical picture. We can put wine and cloth on the axes in our diagram, and we'll call this picture that we're going to construct a production possibilities frontier. It's a frontier because it shows the maximum amounts of wine that can be produced, say, given the amount of cloth that's being produced. So nothing beyond the frontier can be produced. We can produce things within the frontier, but resources would not be fully employed in that case. So what we're doing is we're describing the supply side of the economy in what is called a general equilibrium model. So it's general equilibrium as opposed to partial equilibrium. We'd be looking at a partial equilibrium model, for example, if we just considered the supply of wine, but left the supply of cloth or other goods in the background. Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, the frontier itself assumes that resources are being fully employed. And the basic question is, how are we going to employ those resources to produce different combinations of wine and cloth? Well, one of the messages that the production possibility frontier tells us is the very simple one that if we want more of one thing, we have to give up some of something else. Now, in this very simple case, given that we've only got two goods, we can tell that story in quite a straightforward way. You'll notice that this particular production possibility frontier has a special shape. We could say it's bowed out, and that has a particular interpretation in terms of the costs of production. Let's just walk through a simple example to see what we mean by that. Let's consider the production of a particular amount of cloth, and the production possibility frontier says that if resources are fully employed, that means only a certain amount of wine can be produced. So if we're producing 50 units of cloth, we're producing 70 units of wine. Now, to see something about costs, let's consider what happens if we change the amount of production. Let's suppose that we want 10 more units of cloth to be produced in the economy. So we'll move production up to 60. How much wine do we have to give up? What's the cost of those additional units of cloth? Well, the production possibility frontier describes that. Let's say that's about 4 units of wine to produce the additional 10 units of cloth. Well, suppose we repeat that thought experiment, and suppose we increase cloth production by another 10 units, taking it from 60 to 70. How much wine do we have to give up in that case? Well, looks like more. Let's say 6 units. So the first 10 units of cloth cost us just 4 units of wine. Now the additional 10 units cost us 6 units. Well, of course, we can carry on that thought experiment, produce another 10 units of cloth, and we can see that we have to give up even more wine in order to produce that extra cloth. What does that mean in terms of marginal costs? Well, that's simply saying that the marginal cost of producing cloth is going up. For every 10 units of cloth that we produce, every 10 extra units, we have to give up more and more wine. So we can say that the marginal cost of cloth production is going up. Now you can see that the production possibility frontier is kind of symmetric, so you could do exactly the same reasoning going in the opposite direction. You could ask, how much does it cost in terms of cloth given up to get extra units of wine? And you can easily see that the opportunity cost of wine is going up. In other words, its marginal cost is rising.